What's cooking, brothers and sisters? In this video, we're going to talk about the current folder window in MATLAB. That's the one that is titled current folder with a capital C and a capital F. We're also going to talk about the current folder toolbar, which right now in my MATLAB desktop is located right in this strip. We'll see how to move that later on. This current folder window relates to a larger theme in MATLAB, which is known as paths. We can think about MATLAB as having a few different features, one of which in old school language is a kernel. We're actually looking at a graphical user interface, a GUI, that's a GUI, graphical user interface, which allows me to point, click, type, and have access to MATLAB's kernel. So the kernel is kind of like the command space, the working functionality in MATLAB. I kind of like to think about the MATLAB kernel like I think about a librarian at a library, except I don't know that I would work a librarian as hard as I work MATLAB's kernel. But let me just suss out this analogy. Let's pretend that I go into the Library of Congress, which is a huge volume of information, and I want to ask specific research questions of that library. To further this analogy, let's use specific dates and times so that we can get a sense of what happens as I ask questions of the librarian that I'm speaking with. So let's suppose that it is October 15th, which it actually is today, and I walk into the Library of Congress around 4:30, and I ask the librarian sitting at the front desk, please give me information about the US Constitution. Now, prior to me entering that library at 4:30, that librarian has been trained to recognize and understand my command. In other words, when I say US Constitution, that librarian has a Rolodex specifically designed to address that need. Not only has he been trained to recognize my command, he also has a mental image of the library and knows exactly where those documents are stored. So that librarian hears my command, processes the information, goes and finds the specific document that I want to use, brings the information back to me in the way that I expect it, and then waits for my next command. In this analogy, I would say that the words that I'm using to communicate to that librarian are actually either through the command window or through scripts. So far, we've only seen those two mechanisms. In other words, the target or trigger words that I'm using to tell the librarian what to do, I do through syntax or code, specific types of language that the librarian, in other words, the MATLAB kernel, will recognize. To further this analogy, we're going to call the librarian himself the MATLAB kernel. This is the thing that actually does work for us. Notice that the librarian doesn't have all the information that I need, but instead accesses the rich source within the Library of Congress to give me answers to my research question. So too, when I'm accessing the command window or script files by writing syntax, I'm telling the kernel, please go find this information. The kernel will then search through MATLAB's internal library to try to find the specific information that I have. The analogy breaks down a little bit because a librarian is a human and their mental model of the library sits in their brain. MATLAB's kernel is a program. It's literally just bits on a computer, and thus it doesn't have a mental model of its own internal libraries. Instead, MATLAB has something called a search path. The search path of MATLAB tells the MATLAB kernel, these are all the places you should look when your user asks you specific question using syntax. All right, so we've constructed this kind of story about what's happening in MATLAB. Remember, we have MATLAB sitting over here, and the analogy is a librarian at the Library of Congress. In this analogy, the words that I communicate to the librarian are analogous to lines of code that I write either in the command window or in script files at this point. The librarian himself, we're going to think about as the kernel in MATLAB. That's the actual thing that's going to fetch research results and bring them back. So librarian is equivalent to kernel. And then the Library of Congress, this huge set of information, we're going to think about MATLAB's internal library. Now, in the case of a physical human being who has the ability to remember locations, when we ask that librarian where something is in the library, we rely heavily on a mental model, kind of an intuitive geographic understanding of the layout of the library. In MATLAB, that mental model is called the search path. In other words, the search path of MATLAB is a set of locations that MATLAB's kernel is going to look for information that we want as coders. Let's actually switch over to the MATLAB command window and take a look at some of the ideas that we're talking about here. Here we are in the command window. Let's go ahead and maximize it. And then we're going to type a particular command called MATLAB path. This is actually a set of all folders where MATLAB can find information that we might want to use. So specifically, notice the MATLAB path starts with what they call the user path. We're going to talk about this in a sec. Remember, this is analogous to a mental model that a librarian would use to find information for us. In this case, this mental model tells MATLAB, please search all of these folders anytime we write code. Moreover, search from the top down. So the first place I want you to search MATLAB librarian, aka MATLAB kernel, go to the users, Jeff, documents, MATLAB folder. We can actually see what that folder is. Let's go ahead to go to users. Here's Jeff. Then we go to documents, then we go to MATLAB. So if I type any command, MATLAB's gonna first look in that folder. So specifically earlier in our life, we had worked with this quadratic equation solver. That's in a different video. This was a script that we wrote together in two different videos. One video focused on the code, the other focused on the actual documentation that solved quadratic equations. Now, we saw that when we run this, one of the things that happens is MATLAB comes up with this thing that says, MATLAB could not be found in the current folder or in MATLAB's path. In other words, as a user, I've told the librarian, hey librarian, I want to find this thing called Jeff's quadratic equation solver. The moment I told the librarian that, aka gave the command to the kernel, which this case I did it with a push button, the librarian searched its Rolodex of all possible places it knows to look for commands. And these are all of them on my current version on MATLAB. Notice that no matter how much it looked, it couldn't find it because that particular file is not in any of those locations. In other words, as an outside user, I've added a volume to that library, but I didn't tell MATLAB where to find that volume. In this analogy, when I go to run a script, a function file, define a class, access data that I as a user have defined and that's not native to MATLAB, when I run it, I have to make sure that I tell MATLAB where that file is. In other words, because a librarian works at the Library of Congress, if I am a devious user, if I go into the Library of Congress and hide a new book and then don't tell the librarian where that book is hidden, turn around and ask the librarian to find it, they're going to say to me, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of that book. If it's here, you got to tell me where it is. That's exactly what this little error message has said. Now, if we're leveraging this analogy, one easy way to get that librarian to get the exact book that I want them to do is to throw the book on the desk in front of them. In other words, to literally take the librarian's face and force it down on a book and say, please find that book for me. They're going to be real happy because it's literally right in front of them. That's exactly what the current folder in MATLAB does. So if we think about the MATLAB path as the set of locations that MATLAB knows to go find information, the current folder literally is the desk at which the librarian is sitting. MATLAB will always search right in front of itself before it goes to other locations. So when I'm defining the current folder, I'm telling MATLAB, if I call a command, the first place I want you to look for that command is in the current folder. With that analogy in mind, let's look at something called the user path. This is a folder in my system. We already just saw that. We actually navigated to the user path. Notice it's in Jeff, then documents, then MATLAB. This is my user path, and that's exactly what MATLAB is saying. First go to users, then go to Jeff, then go to documents, and then there's going to be a file called MATLAB. The problem that we're having when we go to run this code, if we look at where this particular quadratic equation solver sits, the location in memory is given by this path. It's in users, Jeff, desktop, and then there's the file. Those are different. So my current folder, the desk at which my librarian sits, is at Jeff, documents, MATLAB. the file that I want, the book that I want to access, is not in that location, and MATLAB is now confused, which means when I tell the librarian, go find that resource, the librarian says back, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. In order to fix this, I can kind of navigate to that space. So one way to do that is the native just change folder. We've seen that in a previous video. Another way to do that is actually to navigate back by just pointing and clicking in the current folder toolbar. So let's go ahead and go back to Jeff, and then it looked like we were going to go to desktop. Now my current folder is exactly where this file sits. In other words, I've taken the librarian, picked him up, and moved him to the exact location of the hidden book that I'm trying to find. And now I say, go find that book. Notice MATLAB doesn't complain anymore because that kernel knows exactly how to find that command. So the current folder is a pretty powerful thing because it allows me as a coder to introduce new functionality to MATLAB and then make sure that MATLAB can access that just by being in the location that I've saved it. Because of this functionality, it's really powerful to be able to navigate to different current folders so that I can access anything that I need or that I've defined in MATLAB. Here, there are a few different ways to do that. One way is to click on the different icons. So if I hover over that icon, notice it says browse for a folder. So I can just go ahead and open. Let's go back to the user path or the default location that was in Documents and then MATLAB. Now I'm in that path. Notice it changed. So now I'm in Users, Jeff, Documents, MATLAB. I can also go up in my hierarchy. You see that little up button? If I hover over, it says one level up. So right now I'm kind of 3 levels deep. 1, 2, 3. If I go up, I'm going to go to the previous location. Let's go up one more time. Now I'm in the higher location, Jeff. I can navigate down by simply pointing and clicking. So if I wanted to go to desktop, I go ahead and go to desktop. The other thing that we'll see here in the 2020 version, there's Access MATLAB Drive files on this computer. So there's something called MATLAB Drive, which is kind of like a cloud-based storage system. I don't have that set up right now. I'm not really worrying about it because I do a lot of my work on my local computer. In other videos, we'll talk about how to use MATLAB Drive to kind of store files across computers. For now, I wanted to show not only can we navigate the current folders using this, notice that if I go to these little arrows, so let's start with Jeff, let's go to Documents, and then within Documents, we can go to any of these particular files. So if I wanted to go to Foothill, let's go to my classes, etc., etc., etc. This current folder toolbar allows me to point and click to tell MATLAB where to find files that I want. In other words, it's a point and click access to relocate my librarian wherever I need him so that he can access any resources that I've hidden in that library. I can also achieve the same type of movement for the current folder through command window prompts. I'm going to go ahead and close out the editor because I don't need that at this exact moment. And then I'm going to start by clearing this window. We'll go ahead and type PWD, which is short for Print Working Directory. In other words, this is going to print the exact current folder that I'm currently sitting in. Where is my librarian sitting? Well, right now my librarian is sitting in the folder. First we go to Users, then we go down to Jeff, then Documents, then Foothill College, then Foothill Classes. So this is a chain of folders. Let's pretend that I wanted to move my librarian. To do that, I'm going to change directory, and I'm going to go one up in the hierarchy. What I mean by one up in the hierarchy is we can think about this as the highest folder. Inside that folder is Jeff. Inside that folder is Documents. Inside that one is Foothill College Career, and then Foothill Classes. Kind of like nested dolls where the librarian is stuck in the smallest doll. What I'm going to do here is go to the next highest doll. So go from Foothill College up to the one before it. To go back in the line, that was this button on the toolbar, I push ... and then slash. Did you see that? Right here in the toolbar, I went from Foothill Classes back up. Let's run that command again by pushing up. Now I'm going to go back to Documents. Let's run that command by pushing up. Now I go to Jeff. Here, I can tell what is in that folder by typing ls. This gives me a list of everything in that folder. Let's go ahead and go to the desktop. Notice once I did cd desktop, that meant change directory. CD means change directory. So I was in Jeff, but please change the directory to desktop. When I type ls again, that means list. I am telling MATLAB, please tell me everything in that directory. Well, right now we have two different items. We have something called Jeff's quadratic equation solver.m, and then we also have relocated items, which is a folder. Let's clear this for a moment and then type in user path. Remember, this was the default location of the current folder if I haven't moved my librarian. Here, if I change cd and I tell, please MATLAB, go change directory to this path, so users, Jeff, documents, MATLAB, notice right now that's not where my current folder is. My current folder is in now users, Jeff, desktop. If I run this code, notice I've changed to my user path. I've changed to that default location where MATLAB is going to store files unless I've moved my librarian. Similarly, I can get back to the desktop by just typing desktop, and that will move me back to that location, which means now I have command line code that moves me back and forth in the current folder. Let's go ahead and list all of the documents in this current folder. Remember, I only have one of them. The next thing that I'm going to do is actually to make a copy of this file. In order to highlight what's happening here, I'm going to actually show you what's happening in my Finder. So right now, do you see that when I typed ls in this location, MATLAB said I have Jeff's quadratic equation solver.m, there it is. And then I also had a folder called relocated items. I'm going to copy my file. In this case, I'm going to copy the Jeff's quadratic equation solver, and I'm going to call this a dummy file.m. So what I'm telling MATLAB here is, please make a copy of this file and call the new copy dummy file. Let's go ahead and execute. Did you notice over here in my operating system that it actually made a copy of that? In other words, when I list everything in that directory, now I have two different files, one of which was Jeff's quadratic equation solver, the other one was dummy file. Let's go ahead and open dummy file to make sure that it is indeed a copy. Notice this dummy file is actually the exact thing that I've copied. It's now just a separate file. We can go ahead and close that dummy file. Now, I think that the word dummy is a little bit harsh, so I'd actually like to change the name of the file. Of course, I could do that in my actual operating system if I just push rename. So I could call this smart file. And then if I go over here and I type ls, notice smart file is shown here because I've changed that name. But I don't have to do that through my operating system. I can actually do that in MATLAB. So let's change this back to dummy file. Let's clear this, and then let's go ahead and list everything in that directory. So here's my dummy file. Now I'm going to do something called move file. Move file does one of two things. Either it actually physically moves a file from the current location to a new folder, or it can change the name of a file. So right now the file in Target is called dummy file. We're going to change that name to smartfile.m. And I want you to focus over here in the little window and see what happens when I run this code. Did you see that? Dummy file changed names to smart file. Now let's pretend that I wanted to make a new directory. In other words, the way that I would do this in my operating system is to do new folder, and this is what we're going to call a test folder. Over here, if I ls, now I have the original file that I started with. I have an original folder, then I have my smart file, which was a copy, and then I just made a test folder. Let's make another directory. So mkdir means make directory, and let's call this Jeff's MATLAB files. Okay, so let's go ahead and ls. Now ls again lists all the things in the current folder. Now pretend that I wanted to move my smart file to the new folder that I just created. So one thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and print working directory. This is the location that I'm currently at. I'm going to highlight that and copy. Now I'm going to type move file. Well, which file do I want to move? I want to move my smart file. Where do I want to move it? Well, I want to move it to users, Jeff, desktop, and then Jeff's MATLAB file, which is the location of this thing. Now I'm telling MATLAB, please take this file, the smartfile.m, and move it to the folder in this location. Over in my operating system, this is equivalent to clicking on that smart file and then dragging it over to Jeff's location. That's what I've just done there. If I want to move it over, I can move it back. Let's take a look at running this code. Here's a claim. When I push enter, the smart file is going to move from its current location into the folder that I just made it. Let's go ahead and execute. Boom. Did you see that? Smart file disappeared. And if I double click on that folder, it is now inside that folder. So let's go ahead and ls. Notice I cannot access smart files. So specifically, if I were to type in smart file, MATLAB can't actually see that because my librarian is no longer sitting at that desk. Look at that. It's unable to resolve. But if I change my directory to Jeff's MATLAB files, and then I push enter, notice MATLAB can find that. So now if I were to actually type the command smart file in, here it is, let's enter, MATLAB actually runs that file appropriately. Now let's pretend that I wanted to get rid of that because it's extra information. So now I can actually delete. In this case, we're going to delete the smartfile.m. Let's run it. Notice that file now is deleted in my operating system. If I go back, let's go back one because right now I'm in that new folder. The librarian is sitting inside the folder that I just created. Let's go one up in the hierarchy. I could do that by pushing the one level up button in my toolbar, or I could tell MATLAB, please change directory by going one level up. Let's push enter. Notice I have now moved that librarian one level up. Now let's go ahead and remove the directory. What directory are we going to remove? We're going to remove the Jeff's MATLAB files directory, which is the one that I just made. Check that out. That directory is now no longer in my folder. That is the same thing over here. Did you notice that it disappeared from my current folder window? Starting with a fresh slate, let's go ahead and change the directory. So we're going to do move file, and we're going to change the test folder to pass folder. Notice that we actually are going to change the folder name. Let's push enter. Did you see this? Over here in the current folder, the test folder name changed to pass folder. So remember, move file does two things. Either one, it moves a file or folder to a different place, or move file actually changes the name of a file or folder. Let's go ahead and remove this directory. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and say rm directory. Directory is another way to say folder. I want to remove the pass folder directory. Once I've executed that code, that folder disappears from my memory hierarchy. With that, we're going to end our practice learning how to change the current folder in MATLAB, and also learning how to manipulate and change files and directories, aka files and folders, through the command window. Of course, I want to give you an overview of what we did in this. So here is a list of the commands that we actually saw working in this video. These were pwd, print working directory. Another way to say that is tell me exactly where my current folder is. cd, which was change directory. We could go up, we could move just by getting the path. ls, which provided a short list of the content in the current folder. We also saw copy file, move file, remove directory, and make directory. This naturally leads into our community challenge for this particular video. In the comment section below, please indicate why we might want to be able to do these type of commands in the command window rather than just only being able to point and click. In other words, we already have point and click functionality. Why do you think it might be useful for you to be able to do these in addition to point and click? I also have another challenge for you all. The analogy that we used in this video was to make a comparison between what's happening in MATLAB and what would happen if I visited the Library of Congress. Remember the words that I used to speak to the librarian. Where is this book? Can you give me information about the Constitution? Those were commands that I write either in the command window or in a script file. The librarian in MATLAB we call the kernel. The library information was also called libraries in MATLAB. The mental model in the librarian's brain of where to find information was something called the path in MATLAB. It was the list of all places that the MATLAB kernel should go to find information. The challenge that I have for you all is, can you come up with a better analogy to describe what's happening when we type in MATLAB commands? This is kind of clunky, but it does give an overview of what paths mean and also why the current folder is useful. The way that I think about the current folder from this analogy is, it's the location that I place the librarian to search for information. That's useful because in the library analogy, I can actually add new books to the library, and until I've told the librarian where to look, he's going to be really confused. However, if I take the librarian and place them at the desk where I put the book, no problem. They will look right in front of them and then return any information that I want from that book. That is what we're doing when we're changing the current folder. We're telling MATLAB's kernel, if I call some function, if I ask you to produce some information, look first in the current folder. If you don't find that information in that folder, then go search your entire path. I did want to show you one kind of fun feature of this. Let's go ahead and type MATLAB path. I wanted to show you at the top, classic MATLAB. We're going to go into the, yeah, there it is. So check this out. MATLAB is telling me if I want to find this information, I can actually go to Applications, and then I can go down to MATLAB 2020B. In this case, I'm going to type Show Package Content. It's usually hidden. Once I do that, it's going to say go into Toolbox. So here's the toolbox. And then MATLAB. This is a folder, so these are all different places that my librarian is going to search. I am now inside a folder that has a ton of MATLAB functions that I can call. So if I go to LMAT, that's elementary matrices. If I go in there, there's a bunch of things called cat, diag, EPS, I, false. We'll look at some of those functions later. I did want to go to elementary functions, or LFun. Notice that this is the actual location of a ton of functions that MATLAB uses to do math. We've actually seen some of these: sine, sine d, real square root. Check this out. Let me go ahead and clear the window, and then I'm going to go ahead and open. Let's try sine d. Let's see if we can open MATLAB's function for calculating degrees. This says sine d is the sine of an argument in degrees. It has some help functionality. Hey, MATLAB hides that code from me. So MATLAB is not telling me how it calculates the sine of a degree. But if I were to type in real square root, let's go ahead and open real square root. Notice MATLAB is telling me this is in a read only. That's because part of what MATLAB gets paid for is to write these functions. These are what you might call the secret sauce of MATLAB. So there's some algorithm that does this. But this one allows me to open the function real square root. And look at this one. This one makes me laugh. So this function, when I type real square root of 4, what MATLAB does is uses its own square root function, and then also it actually checks is real y. So it checks if y is a real number, and if not, so it will produce the square root, have a background, and then it will check, is that background actually a real number? And if it doesn't, it will give this error message. So let's go ahead and do real square root of -1. That error message, real square root of -1 is I. So square root produces I. MATLAB checks. If y is not real, this means not, then produce this error message. And that's exactly what we see here. It produced that error message. The point of this demonstration was to show you that in this folder are all of the different functions that MATLAB uses when I call. So I can also try to open the square root function. I don't think MATLAB's going to give me access to that because calculating square roots is actually kind of hard. So I imagine they paid some coders to spend like months of their life trying to figure this out. Indeed, I don't actually see the source code. This is a read only in this location. The point of this demonstration though was when we go ahead and type MATLAB path, every single one of these folders has a ton of information, just like the ones you see here, that provides the core functionality. The path in MATLAB is the map that our librarian uses to find the information that we call in any given function or any different piece of code that I give to MATLAB. That concludes this video. Hopefully that gives you some insight inside the hood. We'll use this as we start to develop function and script files so that we're sure to move the current folder where we are working. Thanks for your attention, y'all. I'll see you in the next one.